I have a question that gets to, which is a pretty important definitional term for the purposes of this panel. So I'm going to ask each of the witnesses to answer it. And I'll start with Mr. Wilson, and I'll move across the table and then end with you, Dr. Walters. So the question is, we're here on this panel. We've called it an overescapement panel. What does overescapement mean? And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Wilson.
Prior to contact, I think there's significant evidence that salmon populations may have been substantially larger in the Fraser than they are now. And I think that these large and perhaps cyclic returns were associated with very significant nutrient inputs into fresh water on a fairly regular basis. I think these ecosystems in all likelihood adapted to this periodic significant influx of nutrition. It supported lake productivity, stream productivity, and while we can have a debate about exactly how those nutrients were used, they were used. Over-escapement really can only be understood if we call it by its proper name, and I think in this case it's underfishing. We're not harvesting all the fish that have been identified as surplus to the escapement goal using the kinds of management models and processes we currently use. But it shouldn't be construed as biologically harmful in any way. I think it was a natural part of the process, a natural part of the ecosystem. You know, if you look this year at the very large returns to the Shuswap, we saw a redistribution of spawning effort and large numbers of spawners in lots of places in the Shuswap where traditionally we haven't seen large returns. So if you imagine a world where these very large escapements were commonplace, I suspect we saw a different distribution of spawners, very large escapements to freshwater areas, lots of carcasses and nutrients that benefited, in all likelihood, large sections of the Fraser watershed. So I guess in sum, I'm simply suggesting that underfishing, and I know when I started with the department as a biologist, it was really the only thing a management biologist could do to get himself in serious trouble, was to underfish. If you exceeded the escapement goal, you could get yourself in trouble if it was a significant overage. So it's really a human yield argument, not a biological or ecological argument. I don't think there's much evidence to suggest that there's any harm being done to the natural world by what are clearly natural events, large escapements, periodic or otherwise. It is a yield argument, and it's about how many fish we decide to kill. I think it's fair to say that we don't harvest salmon for the benefit of salmon. We harvest salmon for the benefit of humans. And over-escapement is exactly that. It's failing to take advantage of the entire surplus as identified by people like us. Thanks.
Dr. Woody?
Yes, over-escapement has had a negative connotation in the industry and I'd say in the biological community locally since the large run and escapement of Adams River sockeye in 1958 that at the time generated something in the order of 3.5 to 4 million fish on the spawning grounds, and the returns from that spawning were some of the smallest on record. And that has never been explained clearly. There were attempts to actually limit the numbers of fish that entered the lower Adams River to ensure that they were not, that later spawners not digging up the redds of earlier spawners, things of this nature. But from a management point of view, over-escapement is the level of actual escapement that reaches spawning grounds. That's, in my context, more than double the MSY point. So it would be larger than the what's called Pmax, or the maximum, the escapement level that produces maximum returns on average. And some stocks show fairly significant declining limbs of the Ricker or Ricker curve that's that's fit to the existing data that suggests that in the Fraser watershed, over escapement can actually lead to a substantially lower total recruitment from that spawning population, and thus it's not an insignificant issue from the standpoint of future returns and harvest. So we're looking at the at over-escapement as being a negative issue as it pertains to harvest in the future.
Thank you. And Dr. Riddle, what is over-escapement?
Well, for the Commissioner, maybe try and put this fairly succinctly. I think really what people are referring to is a significant reduction in the return per spawner, which we call the productivity, when you have very large numbers of spawners on a particular lake, in a lake system. Excuse me. I think both of these speakers before are correct. You put this in a yield context. This is about production, and we very commonly discuss production within the context of the Ricker stock recruitment curve. This is the dome-shaped curve where you relate the number of spawners to the subsequent number of progeny that return from that spawning year. There is a relationship along that, there's a line in that relationship that is equal to the a progeny returning per a spawner. We call that the replacement line. And that, so if you were to pick a point where people become very concerned about over-escapement, it's very likely to the right of the intersection of the recruitment curve and the replacement line, because even in the absence of fishing, even with that lost yield that's implied by that, you would still have a population that will decline in the future. That would be what the expectation would be if you had very large numbers of spawners. Now, Jim has just made a very important point in all of this, I think, is that in many times, escapements that subsequently occur in a year will be on a particular point that might be called MSY, and that, but it's only the very large escapements that should be probably at least twice the target escapement that I think people would really become concerned about the so-called over-escapement, where you would be projecting or predicting significant loss of recruits per spawner. Leave it at that.
And Dr. Walters, what is over-escapement?
Well, when Brian and I were asked to write about this for the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council, we pointed out that there are two definitions. One, the Alaskan definition, I think people call it today, and that's allowing escapements surplus to those needed to produce the maximum average yield. The second definition was a catastrophic collapse in recruitment at very high spawning stock sizes. We argued, based on the evidence we had then, that there was little risk of that in the Fraser. But subsequent to writing that report, two things have come to light. One of them is additional data collected during recruitments from high spawning stocks during the late 1990s and early 2000s. And another was the Gilhousen reconstruction of abundances in the late 1800s. The newer data do provide stronger evidence of over-escapement in the terms of a big decrease in recruitment, most spectacularly for the Chilco stock. And they, taken together with the Gilhousen reconstruction, I think we have to now admit substantially higher risk of severe stock declines and severe cyclic population behaviors under reduced harvest rates.
The point that was just raised by Dr. Walters, where he says that there can be an impact, and he pointed out Chilco as an example. So my question is, does escapement beyond this MSY point that's been referred to in answer to the first question, does escapement beyond that point actually negatively impact the productivity of all Fraser River stocks? Is that what you're saying, Dr. Walters? I'll start with you.
It certainly has impacted productivity of particular stocks like the Chilco, the Adams, and the Quesnel. The data are pretty clear that the highest recoupments to those stocks have been produced at intermediate spawning stock levels, not at the highest spawning stock levels. I think what the Gilhausen and the early data warn us is that we also need to think about the possibility that these effects are transmitted across stocks, that the old mechanisms that cause synchrony in the cycles across the stocks may be reasserted. They may be, in fact, reasserting as we speak. It may be that some of what we've seen in the last 4 years, the very low production and suddenly a very high production across several stocks like the Chilco and Adams, is indicative that the system is trying to return to that earlier synchronized mode where all the stocks are showing high in 1 year, all the major stocks at least, and then very, very low returns in between. I don't think anyone wants to see that world again. It's certainly not a world that would be good for any of today's fishing interests. That boom and bust or feast and famine world with only 1 good year out of 4.
Mr. Wilson, can I ask you to respond? There's the differing points of view from where we started with you have been articulated. What's your response to them, and also to the question that I just ended up with, whether there is an impact on productivity, and if there is, whether it's spread across all stocks?
Well, clearly there's an impact on productivity at very high, if productivity is measured as returns per spawner, there's certainly impacts at very high spawner abundance. And I'm not arguing the point that that managing escapements is important to maintaining human yield. What I am suggesting is that if we go back to the time pre-contact when harvests were low, populations were large, and periodically very large escapements, much larger than we've seen recently certainly, may have been commonplace. This isn't a problem for salmon. The salmon have adapted, and the systems have adapted to this natural periodic influx of nutrients. And I'm saying that from a salmon's perspective, it's not a bad thing necessarily. We don't understand all the consequences of these sorts of large escapements. If you broaden your frame of reference beyond human harvest and the abundance of salmon alone, I'm suggesting that it's an entirely natural thing that these ecosystems have adapted to. And we're now changing the world because we're trying to redirect and have redirected for the last 100 years or so up to 80% of that nutrient for human use. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that it's one thing to say that it affects future yield to humans, and another to suggest that there's biological harm or ecological harm that results from periodic large escapements, whatever the consequences of that escapement might be for future production.
If I could just pick up on something that we heard from Mr. Lapointe when he was here earlier in these hearings. He said that whenever you have extremes in an ecosystem, an extremely high abundance or an extremely low abundance, there will be impacts. And he said it's not benign or neutral to have a large escapement because it affects not, and even if you leave the human element to one side, it will affect other species in the ecosystem. And for example, he gave an example of where kokanee could be severely affected because there would be a high number of juvenile predators, which were sockeye. So you could radically diminish other animals living in that system through high escapements. Do you have any response to that?
Well, only that to reiterate the point that this is a human perspective, right? The ecosystem is adapted and quite capable of using all the nutrients that come in one way or another. There's no wasted resources. It does affect future yield, and it may affect total productivity, but it's still part of a natural process that occurred prior to contact. The salmon were here when we arrived, and I suppose by most accounts were in reasonably good health. So the suggestion that they need us around to kill them in order for them to maintain healthy population levels. I just don't understand the logic.
So would you agree with Mr. Lapointe that there could be ecosystem impacts on non-human impacts, so impacts on other species that from a very large number of salmon on a system?
Well, sure. Obviously, any particular event of that magnitude, you know, millions and millions of spawners arriving all at once, dying and disappearing into the lake, will benefit many, many organisms and maybe a disbenefit to others. You know, I mean, ecosystems are highly dynamic, and they're under a constant state of change. I'm simply suggesting that this whole issue of over-escapement is seen through the lens of human interest, and that from an ecological perspective, it's very difficult to make the argument that large escapements are necessarily bad.
Dr. Woody?
Dr. Walters is waving his hand.
Oh, is can you hold your thought for a minute, Dr. Walters, and I'll ask Dr. Woody and Dr. Riddell to answer, and then we can come back to you.
He's frozen anyhow.
He's frozen anyhow. Dr. Woody?
The concept of over-escapement, particularly in the Quesnel system in the last 10 years, has raised a number of issues that pertain to the management of the fisheries, and we won't get into the cause of the over-escapement, but it's something that's got to be part and parcel of the overall analysis here. But the over-escapement in 2001 and 2002 gave, in the Quesnel system, at least double, if not more, fish on the spawning grounds than what our MSY estimates of escapement would be. And so we're talking 3.5 million and 3 million in those 2 years, as opposed to more MSY levels of escapement of 1.5 million to 2 million on the dominant line, and probably more of 1 million to 1.25 million on the subdominant line. So we're 2 to 3 times, and the Quesnel system is Quesnel Lake. The juvenile size dropped precipitously, dropped on the dominant line juveniles and precipitously on the subdominant line juveniles. And so we're getting a crash in the system. And part of that carrying over, now that was returns in 2005 and 2006. And then they hit the 2009 situation that the dominant line essentially has decreased to an escapement level in 2009, partly on this very low marine survival of only 150,000. So we went from 3.5 million escapement to 150,000 in two cycles, 8 years. The rebuilding of the Quesnel system, if that's an objective that's adopted by DFO, and in order to, let me step back and say that in the 20-year period prior to that, the Quesnel system was the largest producer of sockeye in the watershed. So we've essentially lost, for the time being, the largest producer, which has got to be viewed as part and parcel of the lower productivity of Fraser stocks in this last 10-year period. So the rebuilding of those stocks or in Quesnel system will take time, and it will also require that lower harvest rate continue for some time on those years that the dominant, subdominant line return. So there's consequences in the management of the fishery that are totally independent of ecological and ecosystem issues. But it's also bringing us back in the productivity of the system and production for catch, et cetera, for all user groups, back to a time well before the higher productivity that we've seen in the 20 or 30 years prior to now.
Thank you. Dr. Riddle?
Just going back to your first question, I mean, if you're talking about the effect across all populations and would it affect productivity, well, I think the answer that we would all give is yes, but it has to be taken in a broader context because the Ricker stock recruitment curve alone predicts that you'll have a lower productivity as the population gets past a certain point in terms of numbers of spawners. So the real issue is one of what we were talking about before and how you define over-escapement. And Carl referred to two contexts, which I would agree. One is the potential loss in yield per number of spawners there, but the other is this notion of long-term viability of the populations. But Carl then went on and talked about choco as an example of that. And it's one that I've been looking at recently because the other thing that Carl didn't refer to is that it's a unique situation in choco where we have the smolts enumerated. And the smolts are being quite productive. We're getting some of the best smolt production in recent years, and yet we're not seeing the marine survival. And so I think this other issue that we really have to be aware of now for the future is what are these common factors between the populations within the Fraser, and where is that actually happening? How's that functioning? But I'm not sure that it's simply on the spawning grounds in choco. The other data doesn't seem to support that.
Biodiversity in the Fraser sockeye system was devastated by the Hell's Gate disaster and logging dams and some other things back around the turn of the century. We had hoped that increasing escapements would enhance recolonization in some of the areas from which stocks had been lost. But what seems to have actually happened was that recolonization occurred most rapidly during the periods of very high exploitation in 50 to 1980, around in that time. And I think the big escapement this year to the Adams did see a lot of fish dispersing out to other areas, but it also taught us that that isn't necessarily good at all from the standpoint of biodiversity. In most of the spawning streams around the Shuswap, fish need to spawn in early summer. They're part of the early summer run complex. They need to spawn early because those streams are cold and they need to have longer egg development times in them. And just a few stocks, like the Adams River itself, is the best spawn timing later. But when a large number of those Adams fish spread out into the streams where fish need to spawn earlier, they are in competition with those earlier spawning fish, and if they mate with those earlier spawning fish, they'll produce offspring that are less fit. So in fact, some of this dispersal that people talk about recolonization and increase in biodiversity, increased escapement maybe have just the opposite effect of what we would hope. The other thing is that one of the lessons, as Brian pointed out in the choco escapement went up dramatically in 2000. And we had a period of high escapements that didn't produce higher returns, but returns remained normal for a few years. And then there was a huge drop in survival. That really feels like the high escapements and high rearing densities in the lake stimulated something to develop in the lake that is now killing Chilco smolts when they after they leave the lakes at very high rates. Our best candidate for such a something is parasites and diseases. I got a grad student to go through and look at a large number of Chilco smolts collected over the years at the Chilco fence, and she found really high parasite loads in those smolts, higher than had been found in other stocks. And it's quite possible that high escapements and combined with fertilization at Choco Lake led to a dramatic increase in parasite loads being carried by those fish. And that's what's killing them at such higher rates as you've heard about from Scott Hinch's tagging study and so on. We really need some serious basic research on mortality agents in the freshwater system and how those may be carried later in the life to cause mortality after they leave the freshwater.
Thank you. I take it that kind of work is not being done currently by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
Not that I'm aware of.
Well, I can add a bit to it, and I'm no longer really all that in touch with exactly what they're doing, but there is work going on fish health. There is sampling that goes on. Dave Patterson probably referred to some of this work. Is it a dedicated research program? I don't think so at this time. I think it's more of a sampling program. And as we've talked about in the past, we are continuing to do the work on the sonic tagging of Choco smolts. It turns out to be an excellent choice, but I have to admit it was more by a matter of convenience because they have very large smolts that you can actually put sonic tags in. So it's an ideal opportunity of chance, I guess.
Next question I have, it's a slightly different complexion. We talked a little bit earlier about delayed density dependence effects. Dr. Woody talked a little bit about that. Does that effect apply to all stocks? Is that something that occurs in all stocks? Sorry, I'll start with you, Dr. Woody.
To my view of the world and looking at the data that we have, not all stocks show this delayed density dependence. And that may be simply because of some of the things that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Walters and Dr. Riddell have commented upon. That is, there are stocks that are small spawning stocks and big lakes, and they don't show this density effect on the growth. And when you look at mathematically look at the productivity of the stocks, there's no evidence of the carryover of dominant year effects onto subdominant and off year. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no biological effects that are not being expressed sufficiently to give you an impact, but it's not measurable from the data that we have. And some of those, the more dramatic delayed density dependence that we found are in the quenelle stocks. And I was mentioning this 2 large year escapements. The subdominant juveniles, even though there were theoretically fewer juveniles because there were fewer adults than the dominant year, the 2002 brood, their size dropped considerably. So that seems to me to be the key diagnostic for delayed density dependence. That is, you see a pattern of in the data that shows that there is a impact of the large dominant year on the subsequent subdominant or even later years.
Thank you. Dr. Walters?
Yeah, when we first fit these Larkin models, the delayed density dependence models, within the late 1980s, and the models fit better than the Ricker model, and we thought, but they predict such crazy violent dynamics, it can't be right. And then over the years, as data have accumulated, and most spectacularly this year, or last year, when the Grant et al. Population analysis for the wild salmon policy came out, it was really surprising to see most of the stocks showing fairly convincing statistical evidence of delayed density dependence. That is, the Ricker model fitting substantially better than the Larkin model, and certainly predicting much more of the decline in survival since 1990 than does the Ricker model. So what?
Sorry, can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Not only mounting statistical support for the existence of delayed density dependence, but that it also is showing up in a lot of stocks for which we wouldn't have expected it.
I just wanted to clarify. I think that you might have reversed the names of two models there. It's the Larkin one that shows the delayed density effect. Is that, or did I get that wrong?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to explain, the Larkin model is a statistical model that where we put in terms in a statistical relationship for possible delayed density effects, and then let the statistics tell us whether or not those terms are likely to be different from zero, likely to be statistically significant, we say. And in the early days, it was only a few stocks that showed statistically significant evidence of density dependence, actually none of them. But now, as I said, the Frizzy modeling analysis and the wild salmon policy analysis show it for most stocks. It's possible that this is an artifact of confounding between the effects of population density and other things that are causing declining survivals, coincident with high spawning stocks. But it's getting harder and harder to explain the patterns away as statistical artifacts of that kind.
Thank you. Dr. Riddle?
I don't think I have anything to add to this.
Okay. Mr. Wilson?
I have no comment.
Ms. Baker, can I interrupt just briefly just to ask this question? The panel members, fortunately I think for us, span the history from the pre-Pacific Salmon Commission to the current Pacific Salmon Commission and the management of the fishery throughout that period of time. In the Frizzy model that Mr. Wilson and other members of the panel spoke about yesterday, the terminology used in one of the documents that I read was developing an optimal escapement strategy. I just want to make sure I understand from all of your perspectives, going back from those early years, perhaps pre-1985 to the current time, whether the research that's being done and the understanding of the models, or the models, focused on conservation as the optimal escapement strategy, or whether it shifted from conservation to harvest as an optimal escapement strategy, or whether there's a hybrid or a balance between those two, and how have all those, how is the research? What is the fundamental underpinning of the research? Is it around conservation of all of the stocks in the watershed? Or in a mixed stock fishery, does it take a different shift in terms of the optimal escapement strategy? I'm just trying to understand where you're all coming from in terms of the conservation element and the harvest element, which I think Mr. Wilson gave a good kind of photograph there of pre-harvest to post-harvest. Where is the emphasis? What underpins the strategies in the Larkin model? And where are you now placing the emphasis in terms of the answers you're giving to Ms. Baker when it comes to this description of something called over-escapement, which I think Mr. Wilson said was really underfishing? I'm just having a little bit of difficulty following the underpinning of your answers.
Thank you. Why don't we start with Mr. Wilson and we'll go across the panel.
I think I understand the general argument that yield is greatest at some particular average escapement that minimizes competitive effects and, is more in tune with the average capacity of the environment. I think there are some really important things that are external to these models that need to be considered. We're not simply trying to maximize harvest, in my view, when we manage salmon. We're trying to conserve the resource. We're trying to keep, small stocks in reasonable levels of abundance. We're trying to address the harvest needs of First Nations, which are unique. And there are a whole range of social and even spiritual values that have to be addressed in the management of salmon. These MSY models take a very particular view of the world. If you look at the data on which they're based, it's highly variable. As Dr. Woody pointed out, in many cases they show little indication of declining productivity at large escapements, at least over the range of escapements that we've observed. In other cases, there's a very clear relationship. The Chilco might be an example. So when you're harvesting a large stock that shows this effect, you might want to harvest it fairly hard. Unfortunately, it's commingled in the fisheries with large numbers of stocks that may not show those effects and that may not benefit from being harvested, if you want to put it in that perspective. So it is a compromise. It's not that conservation comes first and we deal with conservation and then harvest comes second. We're compromising constantly in harvesting the yield from the strong stocks, trying to protect the weak stocks, and trying to grapple with values that are clearly external to our models but important to people.
Dr. Woody?
Commissioner, the history of the management of Fraser River sockeye goes back certainly, when I say management of the fishery, I'm talking about managing the times and places that fishermen are allowed to harvest sockeye. The treaty between Canada and the U.S. that established the IPSFC was signed in 1937. The staff was established in 1938, but as part of the agreement that the U.S. inserted, it was to collect data for 8 years before taking management responsibility in 1946. And at that point in time, most of the stocks, except for the late Shuswap Adams stock, most of the other stocks were in a depleted situation because there had not been much conservation effort. The IPSFC closed the fishery in the first half of the year completely for 4 years to try to rebuild those stocks, conservation, rebuilding, and so on, and built the fishways at Hell's Gate and Bridge River Rapids and so on, and started the collection of data, and then there was a noticeable shift in objectives after that to harvesting, but the development of optimal escapements was very tenuous for many years simply because there was very little data that could be used, that is, the stocks hadn't grown to the point of reaching that MSY point or optimum yield point. And therefore, they were being harvested, perhaps from retrospective view, harvested too intensely in some cases. But through that whole period of time up until the PSC treaty was signed in 1985 and the Fraser River panel took responsibility in 1986, the smaller stocks and off-year abundances and many of the larger stocks increased substantially. And I did a wrote a paper in about 1990 looking back at that process, and it was really convincing that there had been a rebuilding of the stocks, and that conservation was in fact the first objective for most cases, but that when you started getting the stocks rebuilt, then harvest became a vital part of that overall management strategy. But when we, and DFO, I'm not speaking for DFO, but have been managing the fishery in the more modern time, if you will, from the 80s on, whenever there's been a lower recruitment of adults because of marine conditions or whatever, the first thing to go is catch. And I remember the difficulty of closing the fisheries in 1995 and 99, and then the Fraser River panel had to do that in 99, and then during the 90s and some of those years. What we haven't discussed in part of that whole issue is, of course, the changing environmental conditions that the fish were facing. You've heard about some of that, I'm sure, but the demands have always been to try to ensure that escapement, viable spawners are reaching the spawning grounds as a primary objective. And sometimes that means that there isn't much, if any, catch taking place. And fishermen are being held hostage, in a sense, to the reproduction dynamics of the fish.
Dr. Riddle?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, if you didn't appreciate it, you've asked a huge question there, really, with pretty much the whole essence rolled up. I think your use of the evolution is a good analogy, because our understanding is always evolving, which we would certainly hope with the science programs. But I think that your contrast of harvest to conservation is actually not really what we try to accomplish anymore. There's no question there has been a change over time from a primary harvest and largely into commercial fisheries because of the abundance of fish and that. And now, of course, there is a stronger concern about biodiversity around the world. In particular, we have concerns about conservation for some populations in the Fraser River. So there has been a significant change in how these things are actually used. Our understanding of what we're talking about in over-escapement really has to be considered in terms of the population dynamics within a population, because it does relate to the habitat capacities and characteristics of a particular lake and so on. That understanding has really changed quickly, and this, I think, is the main point that I saw Carl presentation at SFU a few months back now, which was a very nice representation of how our thinking about population dynamics and appropriate models has changed through time. Excuse me. And I think that it's fair to say that the Larkin model that we're referring to now, which really is an interline expansion of the Rickert model, and with that understanding has evolved really only in the last maybe couple of years. And that Carl's done some work, and Carl's referred to the work that the science branch has been doing. What we're really confronted with now is that the wild salmon policy is now the basic salmon management framework. All right, and that has 4 principles. It doesn't say that it's conservation only. That it has 4 principles that are conservation, respect for First Nation rights, sustainable fishing, and transparency. And the transparency element is to include the users in making decisions and understanding what the decisions are based on. So really, I think now it's a much more complicated world, unfortunately, because in the broadest context, our goal is optimal benefit really is what we're talking about. And it's not one objective anymore. We try to maximize production for fisheries, and then at the same time, there are requirements to meet First Nation needs in the river, there's requirements to sustain the conservation units, and we need to involve user groups more. And later in the presentation, hopefully, we'll talk about how to do this better in the future.
Thank you. And Dr. Walters?
Yeah, all of our analyses are based on the presumption of sustainability. We would not have a model allow a lot of harvest if it meant a large loss of production in the future. The controversies come over three issues. One of them is whether to stabilize the exploitation rates in order to stabilize fishing opportunities, which sometimes results in under-escapements and sometimes in over-escapements and reduces the yield a bit. That's being done in some fisheries. It certainly is better for industry, although it loses biological yield. Another fundamental issue concerns the new fitting of the Larkin models, which indicates much lower escapement goals than most of us are comfortable with. For example, we've almost entirely avoided fishing the early Stewart for the last several years, with escapement goals in the order of 100,000 to 160,000 fish. The Larkin model says we should only be allowing about 30,000 spawners a year, and that productivity will increase substantially and the fish will do well. Then the third problem is protection of weak stocks that are harvested together with the big ones. Our classic example of that is the cultus. The cultus problem isn't a recent problem. Cultus stock started to decline in 1970. Has been declining ever since then. And the basic reason for that was that the development of the Weaver Creek spawning channel that dumps very productive stock into Harrison Lake and was discovered in the 70s to be capable of producing yields of about 300,000 sockeye a year, every year out of a 4-year cycle in the late run. So fishing targeted at it on the late run, the high exploitation rates to take that enhanced production did in the cultus. By 1980, we were looking at the cultus data and saying if you keep fishing at these high rates that the Weaver can withstand, to get those 300,000 Weaver fish on average a year, you will drive the cultus stock extinct. It was very clear that that it couldn't take the exploitation rates and was collapsing. At that time, my recollection is that there was an explicit shrugging of the shoulders decision to write off cultus. And I suspect that from an pure economic point of view, if we were to look at the value of the 300,000 Weaver fish that we can catch each year and compare it to the 50,000 that we could ever catch with luck from cultus, that write-off was not a bad decision. But that's the kind of trade-off we're facing in the biodiversity part of your question, is whether it's worth trying to protect these small stocks, small and unproductive stocks.
Can we make a point?
Yep.
And that, Carl, I read that comment you just made about a conscious decision to not protect cultus in the early 90s in one of the other papers I read. And I have to admit, I have no recollection of any such discussion. And that, so before we leave that as a matter of record, I mean, is there any way? I really have no recollection of any such discussion, and at the time that we're talking about, it would not have been an easy discussion in any way. So I'm really concerned that...
It was more a shoulder shrugging in a couple of meetings. The context for that was when policy and planning, Al Wood and others, were looking at the whole business of the impact of cell-mounted enhancement in general on wild stocks. And the cultus case was held up as a really good example of where having an enhanced stock being fished together with the wild stock could very well result in disappearance of the wild stock. And in that case, I remember sitting around tables where people shrugged their shoulders and said, well, we can't give up those 300,000 fish just to protect a potential catch of 50,000. I don't know, Jim, can you speak to this in terms of the Commission's decisions about what to do when the cultus started to decline in the 70s?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, there's no doubt that the IPSFC, which built the spawning channel on Weaver Creek and was desirous of harvesting those fish, particularly in the non-Adams years. So there'd be 2 years of dominant, subdominant Adams, and Adams would drive the management. The other 2 years, then the Weaver stocks often were large enough to drive the management of the fishery. And at some point in time, well, a few years back, Neil Schubert circulated a memo that I wrote back in 1980 or so, or 70s, that addressed that whole issue. But it was a situation that the cultus actually hit a low point in what would be the early 80s. So it had plateaued out. It wasn't going extinct, but some lines were very low in abundance. But the real problem with cultus now is not harvest, it's the early upstream migration and mortality of late-run sockeye, which, in my thinking, is the elephant in the room with your inquiry. That is the thing that has dominated the management, that has caused over-escapement on some summer-run stocks, and yet has been so pervasive to reduce the productivity of late-run stocks that it's got to be seen as being part and parcel of your real, the real problem here. And when I talk about that, I get blank looks from a lot of people because they haven't been involved. But the story is very briefly, beginning in the mid-90s, the late-run sockeye started migrating into the river earlier than they had been in the past. Normal behavior would be that they would arrive in the Strait of Georgia from first week after the first week of August to the first week of September. They'd delay there for 3 to 6 weeks. Then they'd migrate up the river to their spawning grounds and spawn. But beginning in the mid-90s, the upstream migration, and every year, I'll say this publicly, every year from 1995 to today, late-run sockeye have a migration behavior pattern which is atypical compared to the 50 years prior to that we have records. And that the managing of the consequences of that early upstream migration and mortality of those fish had been the key management issue that has consequently affected cultus in particular. I don't know how much you've
Well, I think we might
heard
touch
about all of that, but some of what we're seeing now is a consequence of those issues, and should be discussed very clearly.
It's 12:33. We were going to talk about that issue that you've just raised later in my questions, so maybe we'll come back to that. after the lunch break. So we'll be breaking for an hour and a half. Dr. Riddle will be back at 2 o'clock our time. Sorry, Dr. Walters.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 o'clock. I believe that'll be 5 o'clock your time, Dr. Walters?
Yep. I think I'll shut off my phone and I'll ring back in at 2. Is that okay, John?
That is fine. Perfect.
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 John?
That is fine. Perfect.